So I'd really just like to put out a question that I'd like us to discuss more fully. And so I'm not necessarily going to make a proposal or provide solutions, but to talk about one of the issues that we are working with, the tool that we're working with within the water justice movement, and get your thoughts and feedback on this. So the question I'd like to pose is, how do we achieve publicness? As a campaigner, I'm always interested in what tools are available to us. And for some time within the water justice movement, we've been working with the human right to water as a tool. But the human right to water isn't necessarily, our central premise. It's not our core. It is not our long-term goal. Our central premise, our operating principle, is that water is a commons. That water belongs to all, that water cannot be privatized, it cannot be commodified, it cannot be marketized. And in the campaigns that we run, we work to stop the corporate takeover of water in all its different forms. So in South Africa, we've worked with communities in the past, with the APF and other groups to support struggles to stop water meters. In Latin America, it's been corporate takeover of water through Canadian mining companies, and so on. So it takes different forms, but the end goal is to support water as a commons. And it's funny to talk about alternatives within the context of water, because unlike in other sectors, public water is not the alternative, it's actually the norm. And despite all of the struggles that we continue to deal with, all of the significant threats to public water or water as a commons, we've had several gains within the sector, within the water sector. And it is the private sector that's struggling to build consensus around their project to neoliberalize water. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, while there are a variety of different laws governing water, the distribution of fresh water, the regulation of fresh water, that most jurisdictions around the world treat water as a public resource. If you're talking about water and sanitation services, that more than 90% of water and sanitation services are actually run by the public sector. Actually, those figures continue to go up. There have been 86 remunicipalizations, 86 communities that have taken back control of water and sanitation services from the private sector. So I would argue that when it comes to water, we have what you call the hegemonic position. We have public consensus, and the private sector is fighting to get that public consensus. So the question is, how can we harness people's passion? I think people have a passion to protect water. And how do we harness that passion to protect water in order to challenge corporate power, in order to build the world that we would like to see? And if you think and so to bring in a little Gramsci, there's an ongoing war position, right? There's an ongoing battle to win public consensus. There's an ongoing battle to persuade the public, and this is what Gramsci would call a war position. Within that war position, I think the human right to water can be an important tool. Not just as a legal tool, but also as an educational tool, as a campaign tool, and this is how it's being used around the world. Within the movement, there has been a debate about the relevance of the human right to water as a tool, both within academia and also within social movements. There's been a debate about whether the human right to water framework is actually a neoliberal framework, whether we can actually use it to in our struggles to support the water commons, to decommodify water, to stop the privatization of water. And some would argue that the human right to water isn't incompatible with private water, and therefore it's a tool that we should abandon. So I actually looked into this question and looked into, yes, corporations have appropriated the human right to water as a tool. Yes, Pepsi claims that it sees water as a human right. So does Nestle. Nestle says, yeah, water is a human right. Veolia has a charter that says water is a human right. So corporations are actually using this tool, or they're claiming to use this tool. But in looking into how corporations are using this tool, they're primarily using it as a public relations strategy. And if you look at the kinds of policies that they're pushing for, they're not actually calling for the human right to water. And if you look at how the human right to water is used, it's been used more effectively by social movements and communities to defend the water commons than it has by the private sector to promote the new liberalization of water. So some examples of this. I was going to time myself and I didn't, so I don't know how I'm doing for time. No, not yet. Okay. So some quick examples of this. In the case at the national level in Uruguay, the human right to water was adopted within the national legislation in Uruguay, and that was used to ban privatization. So at the domestic level, we have this model of Uruguay adopting a human right to water law that banned privatization. It's been, it was used, and these are, this is a new right, and so there isn't a lot of documentation of how the human right to water is used. It has been used in campaigns in Pachimanda, India against Coca-Cola, and it was a combination of using the campaign as a legal tool, but also as a public education tool to win popular support, to shut down the Coca-Cola plant in Kerala. It's also been used in anti-mining campaigns in El Salvador, in Peru. It was used in Botswana. The Supreme Court of Botswana recognized the human right to water in its ruling to support the Kalahari Bushmen's claim to access their traditional borehole. Now, it's an ongoing struggle, and there's an ongoing battle between the Kalahari Bushmen and the Botswana government, but the human right to water was used as a tool effectively in this case to at least provide access to the traditional borehole while the land claims continue to, the land struggle continues to go on. And so for the most part, the human right to water has been used as a tool to prevent corporate takeover of water resources, and it can continue to be used as a tool to prevent corporate takeover of water resources. It can also, I think, when we try to think of how to achieve publicness, I looked at, I don't know what to call it, but the McDonald-Reuters model, I'll call it the criteria for success. And they've listed a number of different elements of what would be, what they consider successful public model. And the good thing about the human right to water is that it's not just about attacking corporations, but also it's used to challenge the state. Where the state fails, we can use the human right to water as a tool, because the entity with the duty bearer is the state in this case, right? And so if you look at the McDonald-Reuters criteria for success, we've got equity, participation, efficiency, quality, transparency, accountability, sustainability, solidarity, public ethos, transferability. So how do we achieve these things? And I've highlighted in bold elements that are also included within the human right to water. So the human right to water requires equity or non-discrimination. It calls for greater attention to disadvantaged groups. It calls for greater attention to gender equity. So unlike, if you follow the Millennium Development Goals, unlike the MDG targets, which called for improved access to water, which meant that countries could just improve their access to groups that were already, 5 more minutes, that already had access to water, and then claim that they had met their Millennium Development targets. The human right to water requires that attention first go to those who are most disadvantaged, and ensures gender equity. And accountability, the human right to water can be an additional mechanism of accountability. It provides a tool for enforceability, and it provides an effective remedy when rights are denied. So it gives communities a direct tool to use. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about participation, because I do think participation is one aspect that is actually quite well entrenched in human rights law, so not just in the Human Right to Water, which calls for public participation in decision making, but also in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which calls for free, prior, and informed consent by Indigenous people, the ILO Convention 169, and so public participation, actually, we've seen a lot of gains in this area within human rights law. And one example that I think is a fantastic example of public participation in decision making, of communities claiming that right when the state denied it to them, is the case of Guatemala, where mining impacted communities set up their own consultation models, or consultation consultants, they call them. And so they set up town hall meetings and set up consultations on the mining projects that were taking place, or that were to take place in their community. So the state was failing in its duty to consult, and over 70 communities set up public consultations that were then recognized by the Guatemalan courts, and over 1 million people voted in these consultations to reject, overwhelmingly reject mining projects in Guatemala. And so this is an excellent example of using the right to participate. So I'll leave it at that, actually, because I do want us to have a fuller discussion on what you think about all this. But, you know, basically, I think the human right to water, while it has its limits, and I recognize it has its limits within, you know, counter-hegemonic strategy within our revolution for a better world, it does have a role to play in our transition from a highly neoliberalized world, and it gives us a tool to challenge the powers that be.